Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and I'm really excited that you're here today because today I'm just getting straight into it and we're talking about some reader and listener questions. And these are things that I've been asked recently, and these were some really great questions that came from people. And I got to say, it was quite eye-opening to me when we were talking about some of these things, with people that I've met and talked about gardening with, or things that have come through on the email or comments and stuff. Like, questions are, one of those great learning tools that we have. And probably one thing that most gardeners don't seem to confess to is that we've all had to learn how to garden. And there is no such thing as a stupid question when it comes to gardening, because whatever mistakes you've made when it came to gardening or trying to start a garden, I can almost guarantee that every other gardener has done the same thing at some point. So one of the things that I wanted to discuss today was, about asking questions. And I know that for some of the people that I talked to when I was creating this list together, said that a lot of the questions that they've always wanted to ask, they were frightened to ask, really, or embarrassed to ask, because when they asked something previously to, a master gardener or, people at the department store or the hardware store, big box store, wherever, the garden nursery, they were either met with a "I don't know" or a response that made them feel really stupid. So I want to go through some of these questions today, because I'm pretty sure that some of these questions are not localized to this one person who asked them. And I think this might be an interesting episode for you guys too. So let's get going. So, question number 1. How do I start a garden? And my first question is always going to be, do you like to dig? And of everybody who's ever asked me this question, and there's been quite a lot, the resounding answer has always been no. I wonder why we don't like to dig. I learnt how to grow a garden with a traditional method of gardening that involved double digging. And that is where you would dig a trench and then you would go a spade deeper and dig that over. And then you would move back a row, dig a trench, and then everything that was in that first spade width would go back into the trench that you just made. Okay, it's a very traditional kind of gardening method, especially for the UK. If you guys don't know already from my accent, I'm from England originally, and that's how I learned to garden. That's how all the guys on the allotment did it. That's how my grandparents taught me to do it. That's kind of how I thought gardens were, until I started growing fruit and veggies in the properties that I was renting. And a lot of these places I couldn't plant a garden in the backyard because they were more ornamental gardens, we'll say, and there just wasn't, I couldn't do it as part of the contract that I was in. So I would grow veggies in containers, and not just veggies either. I also grew fruit trees in containers. And where I lived when I was in my mid-20s, there was a gravel area in the backyard, like a gravel patio. And that's where I just had all these containers. There were, plastic ones. There was some ceramic ones, but I mostly grew in these kind of fabric or woven plastic vegetable bags I think they were called, and they worked absolutely fantastically. And I think I picked them up from one of the grocery stores, and they weren't really that expensive, but boy oh boy did I get a lot of fresh veggies and fruits and stuff from those. And I remember it to this day. One of the most exciting days that I ever had was going outside, picking the blackberries and the black currants and the red currants from the bushes that were growing just right out there on the gravel in the containers. It was fantastic. So I want to tell you that if you don't have a garden that you could, or a yard that you can start digging up to put a garden in, don't worry, because there are options to be able to grow in containers, and you can be successful doing that. And the great thing about containers, actually, and one of the advantages that you will have over somebody who doesn't have containers, is you can move them about the garden. So if you find that you've got plants that aren't doing very well in one particular spot, you can move them to another to see if they perk up a bit. Can't really do that with another type of garden. But a no-dig garden could also be raised beds, and that's what I have growing now. Everything that I grow predominantly for the family is in a raised bed, and they are about 2.5 feet from in depth, and they're 5 foot in length by about 2 foot in width. So I've got quite a deep bed to grow in, and the reason why they're so deep is because I like to grow things like Jerusalem artichokes, potatoes, that kind of stuff in them. And it's always kind of exciting to dig through there. But some of the beds that I created, I used a lot of kind of brush and clippings and stuff from the garden to kind of bulk it out a bit, because when I first bought the house, I didn't have tons of money to sink into purchasing compost and stuff like that, or raised bed soil to go into them. So I made some concessions and put in things like, the leaves from the trees and stuff like that to kind of bulk it out a bit. And it worked well. And the garden's grown, really well since then. But if you're not dapper with a hammer, or handy with a drill or a saw or anything like that, don't worry, because you can create raised beds without those things. There are some fantastic raised beds that I've seen with those breeze blocks, and I can't think of what the name of them here in the US is, but they're concrete blocks that have got 2 square holes in them going all the way through, and they're usually in the construction area of the hardware store, and they're pretty reasonable. And I've seen people build raised beds with those, and they work fantastically well. I have also made raised beds myself with a couple of wooden boards that had seen better days, that were propped up by, or were leaning against, a couple of bricks. So I just kind of put them up on the short end, so the boards were kind of upright, not stuck in the air the whole time, but were upright off the ground a few inches, tall, to kind of make the border of the bed. And then I just kind of added in compost and stuff inside of there, and that's what I grew in. That's how I did my allotment, and that worked really well too. I also have seen and done myself lasagna gardening, which is a no-dig, where you basically lay a cardboard down to smother the grass, and then you would layer down other material that will break down, things that are compostable, whether it's dried leaves, and then some manure, and then some compost on top, and a bit of topsoil and stuff. And they've worked really well too. So you kind of heap everything together and layer it on, layer after layer, like building a lasagna. And you would have this mound of stuff that you can plant in by the end of it. And that worked really well too. And that's kind of how I did the garden before we put in the wooden raised beds. So that worked quite well for a year and a half. Where I live here in Utah, but I also have a test bed, we'll say, and this is an area of the garden towards our greenhouse, and it gets sun. It doesn't get sun all day every day like the main garden does, because the main garden's on the south side. But this is an area where I've been testing kind of bio-intensive gardening methods. So I've been going back to double digging and working in compost and trying things like trench composting and a few other bits and pieces. And if you want to do a digging garden, you just need to find an area on your property, or maybe you're getting an allotment space or a community garden space. And, if there's grass on it, you want to, cut that turf and get that up and out of the way. If there's no turf on there, but there's weeds, you probably want to pull those out. And then just dig it over, maybe add in some soil amendments and get cracking on your garden. As daft as it sounds, people get really hung up on, how to start the garden and finding the perfect location for it. And, really it depends on where you're living and, how your property's orientated and, what kind of sun that you get. The one thing I would always say is, encourage you just to find somewhere that you could put some vegetable plants in, pop them in and give them some love and just try. And, if everything doesn't work, try somewhere else in the garden. And you will find the right space eventually. And it might be, rather than you going to the effort of digging in the ground and setting a bed in, maybe just try doing it in some containers first and moving them around the garden until you find that sweet spot of where the plants are thriving best, and then that's where you put in your main garden, and that's where it's going to stay. So that's what I think for how do I start a garden. Find a space that you can put some plants in and give them some love. So question number 2 is, how do you, and this was asked a couple of days ago, how do you have the time for a garden when you work? And it's funny because I've almost always had a garden, apart from maybe when I was in college. That was really the only time when I didn't have a garden. But even when I had a job where I worked far more than 40 hours a week, and I had a 90-minute commute each way to and from work, so that was 3 hours of commuting time, I still had a very, very, very productive garden. And last year's harvests were absolutely staggering. And I put that down to some key things in my garden. So number 1 is that I compost, and I add that compost to my soil. Number 2 is that I have automated watering. So we do have overhead sprinklers. We're switching that this year to being like those soaker hoses instead, but we automated that, so every other day or every 2 days the water would come on and water everything, and if it needed something extra I would do that by hand. And I mulched everything, so that's number 3. I used a lot of mulch, so every time I would cut the grass, because I don't treat the grass with pesticides or fertilizer or anything like that, though some of those grass clippings would stay on the grass, but some others would come on into the garden, and I would use that as mulch. I would also use kind of straw or shredded paper, that kind of stuff, anything that I could get my hands on to cover that soil and help keep some of the moisture in, I used. And the great thing about using mulch is, aside from the fact that it keeps the moisture in, it helps cut down on weeds too, because the weeds, was kind of struggling to come up through that mulch. So that's some of the key things that I do to help me with the kind of day-to-day management of the garden. And I like to go out into the garden and sort of potter about in there. When I get home from work, I'll usually grab my cup of tea and I will go out into the gardens and I'll just kind of check over things and just see what's coming up, and I'll pull weeds as I see them, and either stick them in the bin or just kind of let them dry out so they don't ruin things, or more often than not the chickens get them now. So that's how I'm able to kind of have the time to do the garden, is that I've got some of those time-saving activities in place. And I would say really the number one reason for me having that time is because I use mulch. So question number 3, and I get asked this question quite a bit, especially from pet owners, is can I put dog or cat poo in the compost? And my answer is no, you cannot put dog or cat poo in your compost bin. And the reason is because their feces contain pathogens, which are harmful bacteria or microorganisms, and you don't want that to end up in your food. So don't put it in there, just put it in the normal waste or the normal trash stream that you have. So question number 4, is it okay to grow hybrid plants or hybrid vegetables? And this is something that comes up quite a lot. And I always say yes. It's totally fine to grow hybrid plants. And in fact, the majority of plants that you are going to pick up if you're buying them from a big box store are hybrids. And hybrids are not the same as genetically modified organisms. They have been produced through regular plant breeding, okay? There's no gene splicing or anything like that with them. They're being misrepresented. And a lot of the food that your farmers are growing to be able to, feed not only, a nation, but, several nations globally, they're coming from hybrids, not necessarily, GMOs. And the nice thing about hybrid plants is that they are more likely to produce harvests and survive certain conditions that you may be having. So perhaps you've had problems with tomato blight or wilt that have happened. There are disease-resistant hybrids that are available for you to grow, so you can still grow tomatoes in the area that you're living in, even though these issues happen. Same with potatoes and blight. That was a big problem in the UK. I've had to, tackle blight on my potatoes and on my tomatoes, and growing hybrids enabled me to actually get a harvest. So I don't see hybrids as being a bad thing. For those of you that are kind of on the fence about it, if you've ever had boysenberries, they're a cross between a European raspberry and different varieties of blackberry or brambles. As an example, they're not always bad. They're sometimes actually a good thing because they offer different characteristics and different traits between them. So, there are some fabulous hybrids that are available. You see them quite a lot in kind of the fruit area. As well as, the vegetables, but the fruits kind of give them like a fancy name, like an apple plum or whatever. and they're a cross between the two of them, and people get good harvests from them. So if you are new to gardening and you've never grown anything before, you're probably more likely to get a harvest by planting some hybrids that you're picking up from the nursery than you are by trying to tackle heirlooms. And I say this as an heirloom grower, and heirlooms are tricky. They need a lot of care and babying. And I'm looking at my dining room table right now that is kind of got my seedlings all over it, and I've had so many tomatoes that have just not made it as seedlings because they just weren't up to par. They were not strong enough. They had some issues, just kind of growing normally, and I've lost quite a lot of them. And it's a particular type of tomato, a particular heirloom that I've been trying to grow for the last couple of years, and out of the entire pack of seed, I think I've managed to grow maybe 2 plants this year. So that particular variety, if it doesn't make it in the garden, guess what? I'm never growing it again. But the nice thing for me is I've got lots of seed that I've saved from the garden, so I've got plenty to grow on. And if you're wanting to grow veggies to be able to save the seed and grow on again, then growing hybrids isn't going to work for you because you're not going to get that same plant. It's going to give you a different set of traits, and it may not grow as well the next year. So it is okay to grow hybrids. In fact, I would recommend that you grew a mixture of hybrids and heirlooms so you can see the difference and see what works for you in the area that you live. So that's me and my soapbox about hybrid plants. Question number 5, what is a weed? I can't tell the difference. And this was probably my husband, and so some not the only one either. And I don't always know what a weed is. There's still so many plants here in the US that I'm not sure what they are, and it's actually quite difficult to tell. And a weed is really a plant that's growing somewhere where you don't want it. And the easiest way to be able to tell what a weed is and what a weed isn't is, if you're a new gardener, to grow by planting some transplants or plant starts. Because then after you've cleared the ground or made your raised bed, that the only thing going in there is the plant that you've planted, and if anything else comes up, then that that's a weed. But pay attention and have a look online and do a bit of research and trying to figure out what those weeds are. I made the mistake of cultivating what I thought was a really pretty spring flower that was this kind of purpley pink, only to find out that it was goat heads, and I was not very popular, let's put it that way. So I'm still figuring out some things too myself, but I would always just err on the side of caution and let it get a little bit bigger, and if it doesn't look like the plant that you're trying to grow, then maybe pull it. Question number 6, should I know my soil pH? Well, I don't know my soil pH, and it's not stopped me from growing so far, so my answer would be no. It might be handy for you if you are wanting to plant things like blueberries, which like an acidic soil. You might want to know what type of soil you've got before you go ahead and plant them in there, because if you don't have acidic soil or peaty soil, then they're probably not going to grow unless you put them in a planter. But no, you don't really need to know your soil pH. if you get into gardening big time, then yes, you might want to send out your soil and get it tested and, really hone in on the type of soil amendments that you want to get in there to make it better, because having a great soil is the backbone of a good organic garden and the best way to help prevent disease and pest problems in your garden. Question number 7, how do I know if my soil is any good? This is a great question. If the area where you're wanting to grow your garden in has got stuff growing in it already, it'll be okay to grow your garden in, even if it's grass. I've not really seen any garden or any plants not grow, even in, scruffy areas, that are kind of sparse with weeds. The minute that you get water on there, your plants will start to grow. And, if you're worried that your soil isn't any good and you are concerned that there might be contamination or something on there, get a soil test done, and you can get them done by various places online. They will send you like the baggie and tell you how to take the sample, and then you send them in, and then they will send you the results back. Also, if you're living in the US, your local extension office might be able to help you with that as well. Question number 8, how do I improve my soil? Compost. Compost. It doesn't matter if you've got heavy clay soil or sandy soil, compost will help improve it either way. If you've got clay soil, compost will help break up those particles. If you've got sandy soil like I do, it helps bind those particles together and retain some of that moisture. So compost is amazing, completely amazing, and I encourage everybody to compost for that very reason. I'm just really excited about composting and how amazing it is that you can turn scraps, like food scraps, kitchen scraps, scraps from you trimming bushes and shrubs, cleaning out the chicken coop, like all of that stuff gets mixed together and it turns into this amazing dark, kind of earthy, woodland smelling, amazing stuff that just makes my garden go bananas. So compost is amazing. There are lots of other things you can add to your soil to improve it. You can add well-rotted manure. You can add, like worm castings. There's loads of different things. But, if you're just starting out, just add some good quality compost to your soil and it will help. And actually, I also use compost in my garden as mulch as well now. So I will put a good couple of inches of compost down part way through the season, and then I'll put grass clippings and stuff like that on top as it goes on through the season. Question number 9, how often should I water my garden? This is a fantastic question and loads of people ask it. So I live in a dry climate, very dry, and things dry out really quickly here. And the first signs that your plants need water is that they start to droop and the leaves will be drooping. And they don't really look as vibrant as what they did previously. And if you get your finger and you stick it in the ground near, where the roots are or in the container, if it feels dry, water it and let it, seep in for a bit and then leave it. And then come and check again. Just pop your finger in again. Does it still feel wet in there, or is it still dry? If it's still dry, water it again. I find here where I live is water will seep in a little bit and then it kind of will evaporate off and it won't get down further into the roots. So I have to kind of wet the soil a bit and then water it again, so it will take that water further down into there. So the ideal feel that you're wanting is that that soil feels kind of like a wrung out sponge. So it should feel damp but not absolutely soaking wet. And if it's, super wet, then obviously you don't need to water. But, just keep checking your garden each time, you're taking a walk out there to check on things. Just pop your finger in the soil and see what it is. As your soil starts to improve, you'll find that it retains and starts to retain water a lot better as well. Question number 10. This was an interesting one. Can I let my chickens in my vegetable garden? So first of all, check your local, city rules, city ordinances, requirements for having chickens, because not all of them allow you to have chickens roaming free in your yard. A lot of the times they need to be contained in a run. If you're able to let your chickens in your vegetable garden and you want to do that, that's fine. I don't let my chickens in my vegetable garden anymore because, number one, they just destroy everything, and I mean everything. All that wonderful veggies that you were growing, they will destroy it. And now I grow things sort of around the coop that will then grow into the coop a little bit, so they can peck at those. But the one thing that I found was really useful when I had a garden that wasn't a raised bed was I could put a run on top of that ground with the chickens in, and they would scratch up all that dirt, and they would eat all the bugs and stuff that were trying to overwinter in there. So they did a good job. But I would check your local rules and city ordinances to make sure that you can do it, because the last thing you want is somebody telling them and then you getting fined for that, or your chickens escaping, or getting attacked by predators like the local cats or whatever. So check those. And my last question is, what gardening tools do I need to get started? So that goes back to the question of whether you want to dig or not to dig. It sounds like a really bad knockoff of Shakespeare there, to dig or not to dig. But really, now that I've got raised beds, really the only tools that I use are my garden journal, my watering can, and some garden gloves, maybe a hand trowel. There's not a lot that I really use in the garden now. But I still have a shovel, a fork, a rake, and a hoe to handle, the test bed area. But on a day-to-day kind of thing, when you're pulling weeds when they're small, a pair of gardening gloves, you don't need to be, digging things out particularly. And my garden journal is probably my most valuable tool, because in it I'm recording when I've planted things, what I've planted, like the beds that I've planted them in, things like the weather, any pests that I've seen, those kind of things. And I look back through it throughout the year to, really see kind of where was I at last year versus this year, and is there any difference between them? Is there a difference in the climates, things like that? Because now I'm coming, we're into May, and I know from keeping my garden journal that there is another frost coming, because there's always one right when I'm wanting to plant tomatoes, and that there may even be another snow still to come until after the 10th of May. So, I like to keep those kind of records, and My other really valuable tool that I use is my spreadsheet that I have for planning out when I'm sowing my seeds and when I can expect to harvest. That to me is really valuable because I can pinpoint to within 2 or 3 days that I'm going to be having, my tomato crops coming in, and I'm going to need to make sure that I've got all the stuff ready for canning and taking care of all those. So there's some of my most used gardening tools, and there's not a lot that I really do use. And it depends as well during the time of year, because towards the back end of the year and at the very beginning of the year, I'm using things like my hoop houses, or frost fleece to protect the plants so I can extend that growing season too. So, you got to find the tools that are right for you and how you like to garden as well. So that's all I've got for today's episode. So thank you for sticking with me to the end. I hope you found this useful. Please give it a thumbs up if you did. And I hope that you guys are enjoying this beautiful spring weather and that your garden is growing beautifully. Until next time, have a wonderful week. Bye bye.